The woman walked into the blizzard, with one arm clamped over a flour sack bundle. Her feet had stopped being feet a mile back. There was a letter in her coat pocket, folded into quarters. She would not open it again. Behind her the road had already vanished under 6 new inches, erased like it had never once existed. The wind hit her face like flung gravel. She counted. $4.20. Counted it twice, just to be sure the numbers weren't lying to her too. The stand of pines ahead never got closer. 5 minutes now. Still exactly as far. She went down. She stood back up. She kept walking. Then she walked straight into a wooden fence. Recently mended. The cut post still pale. Behind it, one small window. Firelight. Someone was awake. And the door began to open, before she could knock. The brooch was never in Joe Whitfield's hands. Not once. Not for a second. She knew exactly where it was, sewn into the lining of Bettina Marsh's second petticoat, the one Bettina wore under her good dress on her half-days off, the one nobody checked. Because nobody thought to check a 17-year-old kitchen girl, with a sick little brother 3 counties over and a mother who couldn't work anymore. Joe knew. And she said nothing. Because that was the thing about Joe Whitfield. She noticed everything. Had noticed everything, since she was small enough to sit under her father's desk in the land office back in Ohio, watching him sort deeds by candlelight, sorting truth from what people wished were true. And what she noticed now, standing in the front parlor of the Ashworth estate with Mrs. Ashworth's finger an inch from her face, was this. Bettina was in the doorway. White as chalk. Shaking. Joe made a decision in about 4 seconds. The kind you don't examine too closely afterward. The kind you just do. I didn't take it, she said. Which was true. Then, before the smarter part of her brain could grab the reins. But I know it's missing. And I was the last one in that room. Not a confession. Just enough rope for Mrs. Ashworth to hang her with. Mrs. Ashworth took it gladly. I knew it. Something almost pleasant in her voice now. The particular satisfaction of a woman who'd been hunting a reason for months, and finally got handed one. Too clever by half, Miss Whitfield. Reading my husband's ledgers when nobody asked? Correcting the cook's arithmetic like you were born to it. I was trying to be useful. You were trying to be seen. The smile gone flat now. A thin line. Pack your things. You have until sundown. Every housemaid in that hallway was watching. Every kitchen girl. Bettina with one hand pressed against her own chest like she was trying to hold something in, before it spilled out, and ruined them both. And Joe kept her face still. She'd learned that trick a long time ago. The year her father died. The year her mother sat at the kitchen table for 3 straight weeks, and didn't get up, and somebody in that house had needed to keep their face still, and it hadn't been her mother, so it had been Joe. 12 years old, and already expert at not crying in front of people who wanted to see it. She kept that face now. Chin level. Shoulders back. Even while something folded shut inside her chest like a letter being creased hard enough to tear. She did not look at Bettina again. Because if she did, her face would stop being still, and this whole careful architecture of lies would collapse in front of everyone. The letter of dismissal was written in Mr. Ashworth's own hand. He'd found time in his busy day to compose it personally, which told Joe something about exactly how much this household enjoyed a scandal. It accused her, in careful lawyer's language, of theft, of deceit, of a want of proper character. And it would follow her. She understood that the way she understood arithmetic. A letter like that didn't stay folded quiet in a coat pocket. It traveled. Got read aloud at other kitchen tables, in other houses, other towns, by other women deciding whether to trust her with a broom, let alone a ledger. $4.20. That was what she had. Counted twice. Just to be sure the counting wasn't lying to her too. A change of clothes wrapped in a flour sack. One good coat. And that letter, folded into quarters, riding in her pocket like something alive. She walked out the front gate of the Ashworth estate at 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in November of 1884, chin still level, and made it exactly 3/4 of a mile down the frozen road, before her knees stopped believing in her. She sat down hard on a fallen log. And she cried. Not delicately. Not the handkerchief and sigh kind from novels. She cried until her ribs ached, until her breath came in these awful hitching gasps that scared a pair of crows clean off a fence post. Until she was empty enough to stand back up. So she stood back up. Because that was the other thing about Jo Whitfield. She always stood back up. Practically a design flaw. Cedar Hollow. The cook had mentioned it once, the way you'd mention a place you'd never actually been. A mining supply town. 12 miles east through the pass. Jo did the arithmetic in her head, the way her father taught her, the way she did arithmetic on everything, that scared her. 12 miles? She'd walked 12 miles before. Worked 14-hour days on her feet before. Survived actual things, real things, not imagined slights, that would have flattened women who never had to survive anything worse than a bad seamstress. She told herself she'd survive this too. She believed it. Right up until the sky changed color. Went from pale winter gray to something, with weight in it. The kind of gray that sits low and close, like a lid coming down on a pot. Then the wind picked up, and it wasn't wind exactly, more a hand shoving her sideways, and Jo pulled her coat tighter, and thought, with the particular calm of someone refusing to panic out loud, that she should probably walk faster. Then the snow started. Not the gentle kind. Not the kind that dusts fence rails, and makes bare trees look like something off a Christmas card. This was Montana snow, come down out of the mountains like it had a personal grudge to settle, and within 20 minutes it was moving sideways, hitting her face like flung gravel. Within an hour she couldn't feel her feet, as feet at all. Just two vague numb shapes she was apparently still trotting forward on faith alone. She stopped thinking about Cedar Hollow. Stopped thinking about Mrs. Ashworth. About the brooch she never touched. About Bettina's white face in the doorway. Because there wasn't room left in her for any of it. There was only the next step. And the one after. A stand of pines up ahead that might cut the wind, if she could reach it, except the trees kept not getting closer, kept staying exactly as far as they'd been 5 minutes back, which was impossible. Except it wasn't impossible. It was just what happened when you were freezing 1 slow degree at a time, and your own body started lying to you about distance. She was thinking she was cold. She was thinking she was so cold. She was thinking that maybe this was how it happened out here. Not dramatically. Not with some last gasping speech. Just quietly. One tired step folding into the next tired step, until there weren't any steps left in you at all. That thought scared her enough to make her angry. And anger, it turned out, still had some heat left in it. She used what was left. She didn't hear the fence, until she walked straight into it. Knocked the breath clean out of her. A solid wooden rail, rough-hewn, recently mended by the look of the fresh-cut posts even, through the driving snow. She stood there braced against it, blinking snow off her lashes, trying to make her eyes agree on what they were seeing. A cabin. Low-roofed. Squat and solid against the storm, the way something gets built by a man who understands storms personally. One small window. Behind it, orange light. Firelight. Steady. Tended. Smoke rising from the chimney in a thin gray line the wind kept trying to tear apart, and couldn't quite manage. Jo stood at that fence for what felt like a very long time, and was probably 10 seconds. Because she was not, had never once been, the kind of woman who knocked on strangers' doors. Her whole life ran on the opposite principle. Solve it yourself. Carry your own weight. Owe nothing to nobody, because owing put you in somebody's hand, and Jo Whitfield had spent 24 years making very sure she never had to be in anybody's hand. Except her feet had quit being feet about a mile back. Except the snow was thick enough now she genuinely couldn't see 15 feet in any direction, and behind her the road had already vanished under 6 new inches, erased like it had never once existed. So she opened the gate. The cabin door swung open, before she'd taken 3 steps toward it. A man filled the frame. Tall, wide through the shoulders in the specific way that comes from years of physical work, not a tailor's padding. Dark hair going gray at the temples, though he couldn't have been much past 30. A jaw set like it had been cut from the same granite as the mountains behind him. Flannel shirt with the sleeves shoved up past his forearms despite the cold, like the cold was something he'd personally decided didn't apply to him. He held a lantern up in one hand and looked at her. Not welcoming. Not hostile either. Just assessing. The way you'd look at weather. Or a fence post that needed checking. His eyes went once, briefly, over the whole of her, the flour sack bundle, the coat too thin for this, the solid heaviness of her frame under it, and whatever he saw in that quick pass, it didn't seem to change his face one bit. You're about to fall down, he said. Not a question. A fact delivered flat, the same tone he might have used to say the creek was running high. Joe stopped 6 feet from the door, and some stubborn, ridiculous, freezing to death part of her lifted her chin anyway. I'm looking for Cedar Hollow. You're 8 miles east of it. His eyes flicked once, over the direction she'd come from. Been walking the wrong way the better part of 2 hours. I see. Do you? Not cruel. Just doubtful. The doubt of a man who'd already watched her legs start to shake. She felt those legs go now. Felt them go loose, and uncertain the way a table wobbles right before it tips, and she pressed her lips together hard, and made a silent, furious vow that she was not going to fall down in front of this man. He watched her fight that particular battle for about 2 more seconds. Then he stepped back from the doorway. Come inside. I don't want to trouble you. You're already trouble. Plain. No heat in it at all. Been trouble since you walked into my gate. Come inside before you freeze on my porch. I am not carrying you. She came inside. His name was Silas Cole. She learned that from a land deed framed on the wall near the door, because he did not introduce himself. He sat her in the chair nearest the fire, without asking if she wanted it, put a tin cup of black coffee in her hands, without asking if she took sugar, then stood across the small room, with his arms folded, watching her the way a man watches a horse he isn't sure he trusts yet. Not unkindly. Just carefully. The coffee could have stripped paint off a barn door. It was the finest thing she had ever tasted in her whole life. 1 room. A rope bed in the corner, a heavy wool blanket folded at its foot. A rough plank table, 2 chairs. A stone hearth eating up most of one wall. Shelves, dried goods, tools, a coffee tin, 2 books, and a second door that likely led to some kind of storage lean-to. Everything clean. Everything spare. The particular tidiness of a man who's lived alone a long time, and made his peace, with exactly how much space one person really requires. What's your name? He said. Not a question really. Just words arranged in that shape. Joe Whitfield. Where from? The Ashworth estate. West side of the ridge. Something moved behind his eyes. Recognition, maybe? Or the start of one. They let you walk in a blizzard. They let me go this morning. She wrapped both hands tighter around the cup, the heat biting into frozen fingers, welcome and painful at once. The blizzard came later. I made an error in navigation. You made an error in navigation. I did. He studied her a long moment. The fire popped. Outside, the wind threw a fresh handful of snow against the small window, and it rattled once in its frame like it was trying to get in too. How old are you? 24. Family? None. He said nothing to that. Turned instead and walked to the hearth, added another split log, worked the iron poker into the coals till they woke back up orange, and Joe watched the firelight move along the hard line of his jaw, and thought, he's alone up here. Not visiting alone. Not passing through alone. Built a whole life around it alone. No getting to Cedar Hollow tonight, he said finally, still facing the fire. Not in this. I understand. Could break by morning. Could run 3 days. Could run a week. He set the poker down. No way to know yet. I understand, she said again. Because it seemed the only thing available. You'll take the bed. Flat. Practical. A list item. I'll take the floor. Extra blankets in the chest. Stew on the hook if you're hungry. Morning, if the storm's broke, I'll point you towards Cedar Hollow. A beat. If it hasn't, you'll still be here. She nodded. I won't be any trouble, she said. Which was of course a lie, and they both knew it, and something almost, not quite, like amusement flickered at the corner of his mouth, before it went away again. Miss Whitfield. His voice had a weight to it now. You being here is already a significant departure from my usual arrangements. A pause, careful. Let's just get through the night. She slept in his bed that night, wrapped in tulle blankets that smelled of wood smoke and cedar, listening to the storm slam itself against the walls, over and over, relentless, almost personal. She thought about Mrs. Ashworth. About the brooch she never touched. About the $4.20 writing in her coat pocket. About Bettina's white face in that doorway. She thought, I would do it again. Which surprised her. Because it should have felt like a mistake. Instead, it just felt like the truth. She fell asleep before she could decide what to do with that. On the floor across the room, wrapped in his own saddle blanket, Silas Cole lay awake a very long time, and stared at the dark shape of the ceiling, and thought about nothing in particular. Which was, for him, its own kind of unusual. The storm did not break the next morning. Nor the morning after that. Joe woke before dawn to find the fire already built up bright, a pot of oats warming on the iron hook, and Silas gone. She could hear him outside somewhere in the white roar of it, the steady bite of an axe finding wood, over and over, patient as a heartbeat. She found 2 bowls on the shelf. Set the table without being asked? When he came back in, stamping snow off his boots, he stopped in the doorway, and looked at those 2 bowls sitting there like they were a problem needing solving. Then he hung his coat, and sat down, without a word. They ate in silence. Not easy. Not yet. Careful. The kind 2 strangers keep, when neither sure of the rules yet, when every small gesture, passing the salt, refilling a cup, might mean something it doesn't intend to mean. You cook, he said halfway through. Not a question. When the kitchen girl was ill, yes. They had you doing what exactly? Household management. Accounts. Correspondence. A beat. Whatever they needed. He looked at her, over the rim of his cup. And they let you go. She kept her voice level. They accused me of stealing a brooch. He set the cup down. Did you? No. He picked it back up. Drank. Said nothing further. That, apparently, was breakfast. But that afternoon, when she heard him stamp back in, from his trap lines, there was bread rising under a cloth, and yesterday's stew warming, with some dried onion she'd found in a crock. And when he stopped in the doorway, and looked at the bread, and looked at her, and said absolutely nothing at all, she said, I needed something to do with my hands. If you'd rather I not touch your stores, say so plainly. He considered the bread like it might be a trick question. Ready by evening? Yes. Then I've no objections. He crossed to the fire, held both hands to it. Needle and thread in the tin box on the second shelf, if you're of a mind to be further useful. My second shirt's had a tear at the shoulder since October. She found the tin box. She found the shirt. She sat and mended, while he oiled a length of harness leather across the room, and the fire popped, and the storm screamed outside, low and constant, and the cabin, silent, apparently, for the better part of 8 years, filled up slowly, with the small ordinary sounds of 2 people simply existing in the same room. On the second day she found the second book on the shelf. Thick. worn along its spine. A surveying manual, he said, when she asked, in a tone that suggested he found her surprise mildly insulting. I wouldn't have taken you for light reading. It isn't light reading. Like a correction. It's practical reading. A pause longer than the sentence needed. I hold a land grant on this section. 400 acres, give or take. A man ought to understand his own boundaries. Boundaries you've had trouble with? He didn't answer right away. Picked the coffee pot up off the hearth, refilled his own cup, slow, deliberate, the way a man moves when he's deciding how much of something to say out loud. Last spring a surveyor came, through out of Union City. Told me my north line sat 200 yards south of where I'd always understood it. He set the pot back down. If he's right, I'm short about 60 acres of my best grazing ground. If he's wrong, his jaw tightened, just slightly. Then somebody's committing fraud on a fairly significant scale. And doing it with paper instead of a gun. Which is somehow worse. Have you tried reading the original survey record yourself? Tried. He sat back. My schooling doesn't run that direction. Joe was quiet a moment. My father was a land clerk, she said, in Ohio. Before he died. He taught me to read a survey record before I was 12 years old. Silas looked at her. She looked back. Neither said anything for 3 full seconds, and something moved through the room in that silence that neither one of them had a name for yet. Then, without a word, he got up. Crossed to the small tin box, where he kept his papers, came back with a folded document, creased soft along its quarters, from years of handling, set it on the table in front of her like he was setting down something fragile. Tell me what you see. She unfolded it carefully. A territorial survey record dated 1874. 10 years old now, if a man bothered counting it against this year, and dense with notation, bearing markers, township lines, section corners, the whole cramped language of it, and she read it slow and methodical, the way her father taught her, while Silas sat across the table, and watched her face instead of the page. 20 minutes passed. The fire ate a log down to coals. The wind never once let up. Your north boundary, Joe said finally, is marked at a dead pine, standing where 2 creek forks meet. The left fork is your line. Not the right. The surveyor from Union City said the right fork. Then he's wrong. She turned the document to face him, tapped one finger against the cramped notation crowded into the lower margin, easy to miss, if you didn't know to look for it. Right here. Left tributary, at the dead timber. There's no ambiguity in it at all. Silas stared at the document a long moment. Spent 4 months on that page, he said quietly. 4 months, and I never once looked at the margin. You were reading the bearings. The landmarks noted separately. Common enough mistake. Most men make it. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile. The very beginning of one, maybe, the way a creek frozen solid all winter shows its first thin line of moving water underneath. Miss Whitfield. His voice had changed too. Not warmer exactly. Just less guarded. Would you set that down in plain language? Simple enough a judge could follow it, without a surveyor's manual in his other hand. I'd be glad to. She wrote it out, that evening, 3 careful paragraphs, while he sat, and read over her shoulder, and once reached past her to flip the original document, so she could check a patent number against it, and his forearm came within 6 inches of her shoulder, and neither one mentioned it, and both noticed it anyway. By the 3rd morning, the storm had begun, finally, to thin. Not stop. Just loosen its grip. The snows slowed to occasional flurries instead of a constant sideways assault, and the sky went from the color of an old iron pot to something thinner, grayer, almost hopeful. Silas came back in, from checking the livestock shed, ice clinging in his beard. Another day, he said. Road should be passable by tomorrow. All right, Joe said. She was at the table, the manual open in front of her, 3 narrow strips of cloth already marking passages she thought he ought to see, before she left, and she didn't look up right away, and when she finally did, something in her chest had gone tight and strange. "I'd like to finish marking these," she said, "before I go. If that's all right." He hung his coat. "That's fine." He sat across from her, took out a strip of harness leather, and his awl, and they worked in that same careful quiet another hour, and at some point Joe looked up, and found him watching her instead of his own work, an expression she was starting to recognize, but couldn't yet name. Not discomfort. Not intrusion. Just a kind of study. A man trying to work out something that hadn't finished revealing itself to him. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said, and went back to his leather. She went back to the manual. Outside, the last of the storm breathed itself out against the mountain, and slowly went still. That evening he cooked. She hadn't expected it, came back from the lean-to, where she'd been taking a private inventory of his winter stores, thinking she ought to mention the salt pork was running lower than he probably realized, and found him at the hearth, with 2 elk steaks in a pan, table already set, and he didn't look up when she came in. "You didn't have to do that. I do the cooking when I live alone," he said. "Which is most of the time. Figured I ought to remember how it's done." She sat down. He set a plate in front of her. Outside, for the first time in 3 days, stars showed through gaps in the breaking clouds. After a while, Joe said, "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask. How long have you been up here?" "Alone." He was quiet a beat. 8 years. Another pause. Longer this time. Beginning it was by choice. He said finally, setting his fork down, looking at the fire instead of her. "I served. Toward the end of the war. Came home to a place I didn't recognize anymore, and a woman waiting, who I did." His jaw worked once. Her name was Adeline. Adeline Fenwick. We were to be married that spring. Joe went very still. "Took a fever," he said. 4 days start to finish. Wasn't anything anybody could do about it. Not the doctor, not me, not God, far as I could tell. He picked the fork back up, turned it once, set it down again. "After that I didn't want to be anywhere that reminded me what I'd planned my whole life around. So I came up here. And eventually it stopped hurting." "Stopped?" she asked quietly. He looked at her then, and the look lasted 2 seconds longer than it needed to. "Stopped being the first thing I thought of every morning," he said. "That's different from stopped." Joe nodded slowly. She knew something about that particular arithmetic. The way grief rearranged the numbers on you, the way you learned, eventually, to count differently. "I'm sorry," she said. "You don't need to be." "I know I don't need to be." A small unplanned breath, almost a laugh, almost not. "I am anyway." Something happened to the line of his jaw. Very small. The barest suggestion, on a harder man's face, of the beginning of a smile. He got up, brought the coffee pot around, refilled both cups, without being asked, sat back down, said nothing else, and they sat there a while in the firelight. 2 people. 2 cups of coffee. A silence that had stopped being careful somewhere around the second day, and become, without either of them quite noticing the exact moment, comfortable instead. The road cleared the next morning. Joan knew it, before he said a word, could see it in the quality of light, through the small window, hear it in how the wind had gentled and turned. She was folding the extra blankets back, into the chest, taking longer over the folding than any blanket honestly required, when he came in, from the yard. "Road's clear enough," he said. "Start for Cedar Hollow this morning. I can ride you as far as the main trail." "Thank you," she said, and kept folding. "You'll be all right in Cedar Hollow?" "I imagine so." "Know anyone there?" "No." "Have money?" "Some." He was quiet. She could feel him watching, but she kept her eyes on the blanket. "That letter they gave you," he said finally. "The dismissal. You'll have trouble finding honest work carrying that." "I know." "Have a plan?" She set the folded blanket, into the chest, closed the lid, straightened, turned to look at him directly, the way she'd looked at him since that first night, honest, without pretense, the way you look at someone you've come, in 3 days, to respect. "I have $4.20, she said, "and no plan whatsoever. But I've managed on less than that before. I expect I'll manage this too." He crossed his arms. He looked at her a long moment, morning light coming in slanted, through the window between them, fire burning low, the whole cabin smelling of coffee, and pine smoke, and yesterday's bread, and Silas Cole said, "My winter list is short 3 or 4 items. Salt pork's one of them." A careful pause, words arranged with obvious deliberation, wrapped in just enough plain practicality, that a person could take it, without it feeling like charity. Somebody headed to Cedar Hollow could bring those items back. Save me a second trip. Joe understood exactly what he was offering. And understood, too, that he'd built the offer, so she could take it, without owing him anything for it, not gratitude, not obligation, nothing but a fair trade for supplies carried. "How many days do you need?" she asked. "Not the question," he said. "Snow'll come back inside the week, most likely. Somebody going to Cedar Hollow would want to be back, before it does. If I were going to Cedar Hollow," Joe said slowly, "I'd need somewhere to come back to." "The cabin," he said. "Until the thaw properly sets in." He looked at her, then away, and the looking away was the most uncertain thing she'd seen on him yet. "Then you go wherever your road takes you." Joe was quiet a long moment. "I'll be back in 2 days," she said. She picked up her flour sack bundle, and went out the door. Silas stood in the empty cabin, and listened to her boots going down the path, and put one hand on the back of the chair she'd been sitting in, that morning, and left it there a while, and did not think about anything in particular. Which, again, for him, was unusual enough to notice. He had 3 items on his supply list, when she left. By the time he found a scrap of paper to write it down properly, the list had grown to 7. She came back on the second day, exactly as she'd said, with a pack on her back, and 2 paper-wrapped parcels under each arm, and she said they'd been out of salt pork at the mercantile, so she'd bought salt beef instead, it kept better anyway, and Silas, splitting firewood in the yard, said salt beef was fine, and went on splitting, and she went inside. He set the axe down against the woodpile, and stood a moment, looking at the cabin door. Something had shifted while she was gone. He couldn't put a precise name to it. The cabin had felt different, with her absent, not simply quiet, because it had been quiet 8 years, and he knew that particular silence the way he knew his own hands. This had been something else. Missing. Specifically. The way a sentence reads wrong once the one necessary word gets pulled out of it. He picked the axe back up. He'd think about that later. Firewood needed splitting. She stayed. Not permanently, that had never been the arrangement, and both of them knew it, held to it, mentioned it aloud more than once, as though saying it twice made it more binding. Staying until the thaw. That had been the condition. But the snow came back, within the week, exactly as Silas predicted it would. Cleared for 2 days. Came back harder. And somewhere inside, that pattern of storm, and thin sunlight, and storm again, 1 week had quietly become 2, and 2 had become 3, and the condition, the until the thaw of it, had simply stopped being spoken aloud. Not because either had forgotten. Because saying it out loud again would have meant admitting neither one particularly wanted to. Every evening they sat at the table, or by the fire. Every morning coffee, made now without either of them discussing whose turn it was. She learned where he kept every tool in the lean-to. He learned she took her coffee black, extra measure of grounds, no sugar ever. He stopped sleeping on the floor, moved to a cot he built in the storage room off the lean-to, a thin partition wall between them, and some nights she could hear him turn over in his sleep, and once, just once, heard him laugh quietly at something, a dream, maybe, and she lay in the dark on her side, and listened to that small unguarded sound, and felt something move in her chest, she made a firm decision not to examine too closely. She did not examine it closely for exactly 9 more days. On the 10th day, a rider came up from Cedar Hollow, a boy, 16 at most, sent by the general store, with mail that had sat uncollected since before the first storm, and among the handful of letters was one addressed simply to S. Cole, no other name, postmarked from a legal office in Union City. Silas read it standing in the doorway, snow still melting off his boots, and Joe watched his face go very still in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "What is it?" she said. He didn't answer right away. "Firm out of Union City," he said finally. "Writing on behalf of a rail concern. Says they've had occasion to review the survey history of several parcels bordering the North Valley." He read a line again, silently, jaw tightening around it. "Mine included." Joe crossed the room, and held out her hand, and after a moment he gave her the letter. She read it once, quickly. Then again, slower, the way her father had taught her to read anything that wanted your trust, before you'd earned the right to give it, not for what it said, but for what it was carefully arranging you to believe, without ever saying it outright. "This isn't a boundary inquiry," she said quietly. "This is the opening move of something a great deal larger." Silas's jaw was hard now, set like stone. "There's something else," he said, and his voice had gone low, careful, the voice of a man choosing his words around an old wound he didn't much want to touch. "Ezra Doyle mentioned it back in the fall, before the first snow. Said this same rail concern sent a man around years back, before I ever came up to this valley, asking after land near the North Fork." He was quiet a moment. Land that belonged, back then, to the Fenwick family. Joe felt something cold settle low in her stomach, that had nothing to do with the weather. "Adeline's family," she said softly. "They never sold." His voice was flat, controlled, the particular flat a man's voice goes when he's holding something carefully, so it doesn't spill. "Adeline's father turned them down twice. Then she took the fever, family scattered east inside the year, nobody thought much more about it." He looked down at the letter in her hands. "Until now." Joe looked at it again. At the careful bloodless language, proposed boundary clarification, mutual resolution, fair compensation schedule, words built to sound reasonable, while asking for something entirely unreasonable underneath. "This letter reads like a first knock on a door," Joe said slowly. "Not a demand. An opening. Which usually means the real letter, the one with teeth in it, comes later. Once they've watched how you react to this one." Outside, wind had picked back up, and against a small window the first flakes of a fresh, lighter snow began, unhurried, to fall. "Silas," Joe said, and something in how she said his name made him look up. "Whoever is behind this has been circling this valley a very long time. Longer than your boundary dispute alone. Longer, maybe, than you've understood." He held her gaze. "Can you make sense of it?" he said. "All of it." Joe looked down at the paper, dense, with careful, threatening politeness, built to be skimmed past by someone who trusted the men who'd written it. "I think," she said, "I'm going to need more time than 2 days." Something in Silas Cole's face, guarded 8 years, careful 8 years, closed up tight, as a winter fist 8 long years, eased, just slightly, at that. "Then stay," he said. Simply. The way he said everything. "Stay as long as it takes to understand it." Outside, the new snow kept falling, soft and quiet, and entirely unlike the storm that had first driven her to his gate, and Joe Whitfield stood in the doorway of a cabin silent 8 years, and understood, with a clarity that frightened her a little, that she was no longer thinking about Cedar Hollow at all. She was thinking about the letter in her hands. About a dead woman's family land, and a company circling it like a hawk over wounded ground. About the particular way this man's shoulders had gone rigid when he spoke his lost fiancée's name, and how carefully, how deliberately, he'd said it anyway, in front of her, when he hadn't needed to. And she was thinking, too, underneath all of it, in a small, quiet voice she wasn't ready yet to listen to. That $4.20 didn't feel quite so much like the only thing she had left anymore. That maybe, without her fully agreeing to it, without either one of them saying so out loud, something here had already started to feel less like shelter from a storm, and more dangerously like a place she wanted to stay. Spring did not arrive in Montana. It arrived the way everything arrived in that country, reluctantly, and only after putting up a fight. 1 day forward. 2 days back. The mountain refusing, stubbornly, to let go of winter, the way an old man refuses to let go of a grudge. Then, without announcement, without ceremony, the lower slopes went soft, the creek behind the cabin ran loud and full with snow melt, and the light at the edges of the day turned from flat white to something with actual gold folded into it. Joan noticed the light first. She always noticed things first. That was simply how she was built. Noticed it through the window one morning, while kneading bread dough, flour to her elbows, forearms strong and sure, from months of the same work, and she stopped, hands still buried in the dough, and looked out at the pale gold coming up over the ridge, and thought, quietly, before she could stop herself, I could stay here forever, and not mind it. Which was a dangerous thought. Because the arrangement had a shape to it. Until the thaw. Her words. His words. Agreed on twice, out loud, like saying it twice made it more binding. Except the thaw was here now. And she was still kneading his bread. So. She went back to kneading. The cold frame took 2 days to build. Not because it was complicated, a box of boards, a slanted pane of old glass salvaged from a broken window in the lean-to, but because Silas had opinions about board placement, expressed by silently picking up whatever board Joe had positioned and rearranging it without comment. And Joe had opinions of her own about the angle of the glass, expressed by picking up whatever pane he'd repositioned and putting it right back. By the second morning they developed the system. One of them made a decision. The other stood back 3 full seconds before either accepting it or physically undoing it. Worked reasonably well. Until the moment they both reached for the same corner post at the same time, and his hand came down flat over hers. Either of them moved. 1 second. 2. Then they both let go at once, too fast, like the wood had gone hot. He picked up the post. She handed him the nail. He drove it in, with 3 clean strikes, and neither one said a single word about any of it, and for the rest of that afternoon Joe found herself acutely, uncomfortably aware of exactly how much space there was between his shoulder and hers whenever they worked side by side. Which wasn't much space at all, as it turned out. She noticed that too. By evening the frame was built. Seeds in, a short season bean, some winter squash, something she was fairly sure was a hardy wheat, and they went inside, washed up at the basin one at a time, and she made bread, and he made the elk stew she'd been slowly, patiently teaching him to season properly, and they sat down, and the table was quiet for a while. The good kind of quiet. She'd started sorting the quiets into kinds. This one was the good kind. Solid frame, Silas said finally. Ought to hold. The beans are a 60-day variety. You'll have dried stores before September. He nodded. 8. Then, without looking up from his plate, the way he said things that mattered more than he wanted them to. My mother kept a kitchen garden. Joe went still. Pennsylvania, he said. Before we moved west. Never gave it up, even out here, even when the soil fought her every season for it. A pause. Used to make a dried bean soup. Every November, without fail. When did she pass? 15 years back. Joe looked at him. At the particular careful stillness that came over his face whenever he said something that meant more than the words themselves carried. I'll make it in November, she said. The words were out before she'd finished thinking them. And they both felt the weight of it land on the table between them. Because November was 7 months off, and she was supposed to be gone the moment the thaw held. Silas looked back down at his plate. We'll see, he said. It was not a no. Henrietta Pruitt arrived on a Tuesday. Joe heard the horse first, a single rider, unhurried, coming up the fence line, and looked out the window, and there was a woman of perhaps 45, solidly built in her own right, dressed in her good visiting coat, riding up the path, with a covered dish balanced on one hip like she'd done it 100 times before. Because she had. Joe would learn that soon enough. Silas met her at the door, and Joe, still at the table, with the account ledger open, watched him take the dish, with the particular bewildered stiffness of a man not accustomed to receiving covered dishes, from women who smiled the way this one was smiling. "Heard you had company through the winter," Henrietta said, and her eyes went straight past Silas, straight to Joe, sizing her up head to hem the way you'd size up livestock at auction. "Miss Whitfield got caught in the November storm," Silas said. Henrietta's smile did not change at all. "That's a long storm. Montana winters," Silas said flatly. Henrietta sat down without being asked. Looked at Joe directly, the frank cataloging look of a woman taking full inventory. "You're very young," she said. "I'm 24. And from where exactly?" "Ohio." "Family in the territory?" "None." "I see." Henrietta's smile turned into something that only pretended to be thoughtful. She glanced at Silas. "Well, it's very generous of you, Silas, taking in a stray." "Stray," said lightly. Set down like a small stone dropped into still water, watching for the ripple. Something went very still in Joe's chest. "Miss Whitfield's been invaluable this winter," Silas said, voice gone flat in a way Joe was starting to recognize as controlled, not calm. "Reorganized my supply accounts. Saved me close to $5. $5. Henrietta's smile brightened, entirely unconvincingly. "How practical." She stayed an hour. Talked mostly to Silas, spring planting, the community harvest social in June, the new pastor, and his opinions on proper standards, which she mentioned 4 separate times, and every single time she said it, she did not look at Joe. Not once. Which was its own kind of message. When she finally left, Silas shut the door, and stood with his back against it. "Casserole," he said. "Yes," said Joe. "I don't like casserole." "I know." He looked at the dish sitting untouched on the shelf. "Lived up here 8 years. Nobody ever once brought me a casserole. A beat. They're bringing them now. Because there's an unmarried woman in your cabin," Joe said carefully, "and people draw the only conclusion available to them." He looked at her. "Does that trouble you?" he said. "Does it trouble you?" He didn't answer right away. "I'll leave it on the fence post," he said finally. "For the Doyle's dog." It wasn't an answer to her question at all. It was, possibly, the most honest thing he could give her. Henrietta came back the following Tuesday. The Tuesday after, Clara Bennett, a younger widow, 2 teenage sons, an efficient way of arriving exactly, as Silas came in, from the fields. The Tuesday after that, Henrietta again, this time with a pie, and a longer visit, and more mentions of proper community standards than seemed strictly necessary for one afternoon's conversation. Silas began coming home later on Tuesdays. Joe began finding things to do outside whenever she heard horses on the path. Checking the cold frame. Walking the fence line. Inspecting the creek crossing on the flimsy pretext of checking the water level, which she'd already checked that morning and the morning before that. She was good at making herself invisible. Had practice. Because that was the thing nobody told you about being noticed for the wrong reasons. You got very good, very fast, at learning how to disappear, before the noticing even started. Ezra Doyle rode up on a Thursday afternoon in late April, with his hat already off, twisting the brim in both hands before he'd even climbed down. Silas met him in the yard. Joe watched from the window, and something in the set of Ezra's shoulders made her set the mending down, and come stand in the doorway instead. "Kane's firm sent me a letter," Ezra said. "What kind?" "The kind that sounds reasonable and isn't." He pulled a folded page from his coat, handed it over. Says my north boundary's in dispute. Same firm. Nearly the same territory language you got back in the fall, except this one's got teeth in it. Formal claim of survey error. Filed, not just proposed. Silas read it. His jaw went tight, that particular way Joe had already learned to watch for. Purcell get one, he said. Not a question. Purcell got one Tuesday. Morrison got his yesterday. Ezra's voice dropped. 4 of us now, Silas. All bordering the same stretch of grazing land up north. All inside the same 2 weeks. That's not 4 separate disputes, Joe said quietly, from the doorway. Both men looked at her. That's a coordinated acquisition, she said. Time to land inside a narrow window, so none of you have time to compare notes, before you're each already deep into responding on your own. My guess is the letter Silas got back in November was the reconnaissance. This, she nodded at the page in Ezra's hand, is the campaign proper. Now that they know none of you have lawyered up. Ezra looked at Silas. Silas looked at Joe. She's been reading survey law since she was 12. Silas said by way of explanation, and something in his voice, when he said it carried a note Joe hadn't heard from him before. Something close to pride, dressed up carefully as fact. Ezra turned his hat over once more. Can you help us? He said. Directly. To Joe. Not to Silas. Joe felt something settle inside her chest. Steady. Certain. Get me all 4 boundary documents, she said. Every survey record any of you have got, original or copy. I'll need a few weeks. But if the boundary evidence holds the way Silas's does, this isn't unwinnable at all. Ezra looked at her a long moment. All right, he said. I'll write to the others tonight. He rode off, with his hat back on his head, and his shoulders set differently than when he'd arrived. Silas stood beside Joe in the yard, watching him go. You didn't have to say yes to that, he said quietly. I know. For ranchers. A land firm out of Union City, with real money behind it. That's a great deal more than one man's boundary line. Joe looked at him. I know that too, she said. I'm saying yes anyway. Something crossed his face, not quite worry, not quite something else. He didn't say anything more about it. Just nodded once, went to see to the horses, and left her standing in the yard, with the wind moving warm through the new grass, thinking about 4 ranchers' worth of paperwork, and exactly how much time she did not actually have. The documents arrived, over the following 2 weeks, 1 packet at a time, carried up by whichever rancher happened to be riding that direction. Joe spread them across the table each evening, after supper, working by lamplight, cross-referencing bearing notations against original patent language, while Silas sat across, from her mending harness leather, or simply watching, the way he'd watched her, that first week, except the watching had changed its shape by now. Wasn't wary anymore. Was something closer to waiting. Waiting to see what she'd find. She found the pattern within 10 days. Every single letter cited the exact same firm out of Union City. Kane and Associates. And every single boundary in question ran along the same unbroken stretch of northern grazing land, a corridor, really, once you laid all 4 survey maps end to end, and looked at the whole shape of it instead of one property at a time. A rail spur, Joe said one evening, staring down at the 4 maps fitted together like puzzle pieces. That's what this is for. Somebody wants to run a line north, through this valley, and to do it they need every acre in this corridor. Silas leaned over the table, looking at what she was looking at. Copper, he said quietly. There's a mining concern out of Union City been buying claims north of here 2 years now. Everybody assumed they were only digging. Maybe they were, Joe said. And maybe now they need a way to move what they've dug. Silas was quiet a long moment. For ranchers, he said. Individually. Each one thinking he's fighting his own private fight. Which means, Joe said, the smartest thing any of you can do is stop fighting privately. The lawyer's name was Warwick Sloane, and he came recommended by Ezra, who'd met him once in Union City, and described him as young, sharp, and a little full of himself, but honest, which counted for more. He arrived at the cabin on a Wednesday in early May, driving a hired buggy up the fence road, with the careful posture of a man who had memorized how important men were supposed to sit. Joe guessed him perhaps 28. Well dressed for a mountain road. And when Silas introduced her, "Miss Whitfield's done the boundary analysis for all 4 claims." Sloane's eyes did a small, quick pass over her. Just a flicker. Barely anything at all. Except Joe had spent 24 years learning to read exactly that flicker on exactly that kind of face, and she knew precisely what it meant. A young man, from Union City, in his good coat, looking at a heavy-set woman in a plain wool dress standing in a mountain doorway, and deciding, before she'd said a single word, that whatever competence he'd been promised probably belonged to someone else in the room. "Mr. Cole," Sloane said, extending a hand to Silas. Then to Joe, with a politeness that was really just a thinner kind of dismissal. "And you'd be assisting with the household paperwork, I take it." Joe felt Silas go rigid beside her. She put a hand lightly on his arm. A small pressure. "Wait. I'd be the one who found the fraud," she said pleasantly. Sloane blinked. "I beg your pardon. Sit down, Mr. Sloane." Joe pulled out the chair across from her own, where 4 survey maps lay already cross-referenced, annotated in her own careful hand. "I'll walk you through it, and you can decide for yourself whether household paperwork covers it." He sat. Because there wasn't really any polite way not to. For the next 40 minutes she walked him through it. The 4 boundary records. The margin notations everyone else had missed. The unbroken corridor of grazing land running, suspiciously, in a nearly straight line north, through all 4 properties. The pattern of individually worded letters, all timed inside 2 weeks, designed to keep 4 men from ever once comparing notes. Sloane stopped taking notes about 15 minutes in. He just listened. "Miss Whitfield," he said finally, and his voice had lost every trace of the polite dismissal it had carried on the porch. "Where did you learn to read survey documents like this?" "My father," Joe said simply. "Land clerk. Ohio. 12 years old, and he sat me down at his desk and told me the truth mattered more than how it looked on the page, and that most men who tried to bury a lie inside a legal document counted on nobody reading closely enough to find it." Sloane looked down at the maps. Looked back up at her. "I owe you an apology," he said. "For the porch." "You do," Joe said. "Not unkindly. Just honestly." "I apologize." "Accepted." She tapped the top document. "Now, are you going to help me file this properly, or am I going to have to teach myself territorial procedure, as well as survey law?" Something that might, on a less careful young man, have been a genuine laugh escaped Sloane. "No," he said. "No, I believe you've more than earned the help." Silas, standing by the hearth, through the whole exchange, said nothing at all. But later, after Sloane had driven his buggy back down the fence road, Silas came and stood behind Joe's chair, while she gathered the maps back into order, and he didn't speak for a moment, and then he said, quiet, almost rough, "I've watched men underestimate you 3 times since November. 4 now," Joe said, not looking up. "You've corrected every single one of them. It gets easier with practice. It shouldn't have to." She looked up at that. Something in his voice had gone very plain, very direct, the way it went, when he meant more than the words alone were carrying. "No," she agreed quietly. "It shouldn't." He didn't say anything else. He just put one hand briefly on her shoulder, not lingering, not anything more than a man acknowledging something he didn't have the words for, and went back outside to see to the horses. Joe sat at the table alone, while after he'd gone, looking at nothing in particular, feeling that hand on her shoulder like it had left a warm print behind. The forged document surfaced 11 days later, and it was Joe who found it, and it changed everything about the shape of the fight. She'd gone back through the Union City Land Office's public filing index. Sloan had sent copies by courier, a thick stack of registered survey amendments filed over the past several years, cross-checking each one, methodically, the way her father had taught her, looking for nothing in particular, and finding, instead, something very particular indeed. A second survey, filed against Morrison's northern claim, bearing the same 1874 date as the genuine record. And it did not match. Not the handwriting. Not the notation style. Not even, when she held it close to the lamp and studied the ink itself, the particular slight brown-black tint that 1870s ink always carried, faded now with a decade's age in every one of the true originals she'd spent weeks studying. This ink was newer. Blacker. The paper itself had none of the soft, worn creasing the true originals carried, after 10 years of handling. Somebody had made this document recently, dated it to match the real one, and filed it, as though it had always existed. Joe sat very still at the table a long moment, the false survey in one hand, the true original in the other, and felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the spring evening outside. Silas! He came in, from the yard at the sound of her voice. Something in it must have carried a note she hadn't meant to put there, and stopped in the doorway. What is it? This isn't a boundary dispute anymore. Joe held up the second document. This is forgery. Dated to look 1874, same as the true survey, so it would pass as original if nobody looked closely. But the ink and the paper both say it's 2 years old at most. Somebody manufactured this record and filed it into the territorial index, as though it had sat there a decade. That's not a civil disagreement, Silas. That's a federal crime. Silas crossed the room in 3 long strides and took the paper from her hand, held it up to the light the way she had, and Joe watched his face change as he understood what she'd already understood. Kane, he said. Or someone working for him. Hardly matters whose hand held the pen. Joe's own hands, she noticed, were not quite steady. What matters is this proves intent. This isn't for men arguing over an honest disagreement in old paperwork. This is a company that manufactured false evidence to steal land it had no legal claim to. Silas set the forged document down on the table, very carefully, as though it might do damage if handled roughly. If we can prove this, he said slowly, it isn't just our boundaries that get protected. No, Joe said. It's Kane who goes to prison. Neither said anything for a long moment. Then Silas said, quiet, direct, in the voice he used only for things that mattered most. You did this. You found this. Nobody else would have. Anybody with the training could have found it. Nobody else had the training, he said. That's the entire point, Joe. It was, she realized with a small private jolt, the first time he'd called her simply Joe, since that evening months back, when she told him he could. He hadn't used it since. Had kept, mostly, to Miss Whitfield, careful, correct, a small wall left standing between them. He just knocked it down, without seeming to notice he'd done it. She decided not to point that out to him. Agnes Merrick arrived the following Friday, and it was, in retrospect, the visit that changed everything. Joe had met her only once, before, a member, by her own description, of the Cedar Hollow Ladies' Moral Society, a compact woman, with sharp eyes, and a way of asking impolite questions wrapped so carefully in politeness you almost didn't notice the sting till well after she'd left. This time she came alone. No pie. No casserole. Just a covered basket of dried apples she said were for the household, which she set down and did not offer. You haven't found work in town yet, Miss Whitfield, Agnes said, settling into the chair Joe hadn't offered either. I've been occupied with other work. Of course. A pause waited with concern that did not reach her eyes. It's very fortunate Mr. Cole's been willing to provide you accommodation. Not every man would be so. A pause, deliberately theatrical. Generous. I've repaid the hospitality through work, Joe said evenly. His accounts are in better order than they've been in years. His supply costs are down considerably. And his northern boundary is being defended against what I have every reason to believe is a criminal fraud. Agnes's eyes flickered. Just slightly. Just for a second. But Joe had spent her entire life reading exactly that kind of flicker on exactly that kind of face, and this one was different from Sloane's dismissive glance on the porch. This one had something underneath it that looked, unmistakably, like fear. A criminal fraud, Agnes repeated carefully. That's a very serious accusation, Miss Whitfield. It's a very serious document, Joe said. A forged survey record filed against Mr. Morrison's claim. Dated to look 10 years old, though it's been made, within the past 2. Something in Agnes Merrick's face went entirely still. How curious, she said in a voice that had lost most of its earlier warmth. Isn't it? Joe said. Agnes left not long after, her basket of dried apples still sitting untouched on the shelf, and Joe stood in the doorway watching her ride away down the fence path a good deal faster than she'd arrived, and something about the whole shape of that visit sat wrong in her chest for the rest of the day. She mentioned it to Ezra Doyle 2 days later, when he rode up with news of Purcell's boundary papers, and Ezra went very quiet. You know her husband works the books for a mining concern out of Union City, he said slowly. Joe felt the floor tilt very slightly under her. Which concern? Never asked? Didn't think it mattered. Ezra's face had gone careful now, working something out. Joe. What's the concern's name that's behind the rail spur? I don't know yet. Kane's firm represents them, but the client's kept off every document I've seen. Agnes's husband, Ezra said slowly, started a new position back in the fall. Bookkeeping. For a firm out of Union City he never named to anybody, far as I know, except once, at church, when he mentioned it paid better than anything in Cedar Hollow ever had. Joe felt something cold and clear settle into place, the way the last piece of a survey map settles once you've finally found where it belongs. She's been reporting back, Joe said quietly. Every visit. Every question about who I am, where I came from, what I've found. She hasn't been enforcing community standards at all. She's been gathering information, Ezra said. For Kane. They looked at each other a long moment, the full weight of it settling between them. If that's true, Joe said slowly, then Kane already knows about the forged document. If that's true, Ezra said, Kane already knows you're the one who found it. She didn't tell Silas that night. Told herself she was waiting for the right moment. Told herself, lying awake on the far side of the thin partition wall, listening to him turn over once in his sleep, that there simply hadn't been a good time to say it. Which was a lie, and she knew it was a lie, even as she told it to herself. The truth, the plain, unadorned truth her father had taught her to look for underneath every carefully worded document, was that she was afraid. Not of Kane exactly. Not even, particularly, of Agnes Merrick, and whatever she'd already carried back to Union City. She was afraid of what happened next, if she stayed. Because the women of Cedar Hollow weren't wrong, not really, about the story they were telling themselves. An unmarried woman. No family. Living 6 months now under a single man's roof. That story wrote itself, and it did not write itself kindly, and every week she stayed made the story a little harder for Silas to live down once she was gone. Because she would be gone eventually. That had always been the arrangement. Except she'd stopped being entirely sure she wanted the arrangement to hold. Which frightened her more than any forged document. Any circling company. Any man named Kane ever could. She told him 3 nights later, over supper, after the plates had been cleared, and the coffee poured, in the voice she'd practiced saying it in, low, steady, final. I'm going to leave, she said. At the end of the week. Silas didn't look up from his cup right away. Why? He said. Not when. Not where. Just why. Because it's time. She kept her own voice level, because she had to, because if it wavered even slightly the whole careful architecture of the sentence would collapse. The thaw's held a month now. I've stayed a great deal longer than the arrangement ever called for. I didn't ask about the arrangement. He set the cup down, looked at her directly, and there was nothing flat about his voice now at all. I asked why. Joe held his gaze. Because the women in this valley aren't wrong, she said. About the conclusions they're drawing. Every week I stay costs you more of what you've spent 8 years building here. A breath. And because I believe Agnes Merrick's been carrying word of everything I've found straight back to Kane's people in Union City. Which means the forged survey isn't a secret anymore. Which means somebody may already be working to destroy it, before Sloane can file a formal complaint. Silas went very still. You think you're in danger? I think the evidence is in danger, Joe said. The safest place for it isn't this cabin anymore. It needs to be in the hands of the Territorial Land Commissioner, filed and witnessed, and out of anyone's reach to burn or bury. She met his eyes. I'm going to carry it to Union City myself. Alone. I know how to read it. I know exactly what to show the Commissioner, and in what order. Sloane can meet me there. It's the fastest way, Silas, and every day we wait is a day Kane has to make that document disappear. Silas was quiet a long moment. The fire popped once, low, and outside the evening had gone still, and blue and cool. Then I'll ride with you. You can't. Joe shook her head. If Kane's people are watching this valley, watching you leave, with me is exactly the story Cedar Hollow's already half written for us. I need to go as myself. Alone. A woman with a legal document, and a claim to file. Not. She stopped herself. Not what? Silas said quietly. Not anything they could use against you, she said, and it came out smaller than she meant it to. He looked at her a long moment, something moving behind his eyes she couldn't quite name, and when he finally spoke his voice had gone rough at the edges in a way she'd never once heard from him. I don't care what they use against me. I do, Joe said. I care enough for both of us, apparently, so let me. Silas didn't answer that. He got up instead, crossed to the shelf, stood there a long moment, with his back to her, and when he turned around he was holding the folded joint petition, her 3 careful drafts, months of work, every boundary analysis, and every margin notation copied out clean. Take this too, he said. All of it. Everything you've built here belongs in that commissioner's office, not on my shelf. Joe took the papers from him. Their hands touched, briefly, over the fold of it, and neither pulled away, as quickly as either of them had the first time it happened, back in April, over the corner post of a half-built cold frame. I'll write when I've filed it, she said. You'd better. Silas. Go to Union City, he said, voice gone flat again, controlled again, the voice he used when holding something carefully, so it wouldn't spill over. File the evidence. Finish what you started. A pause. And then come back. It wasn't a question. It also wasn't quite a demand. It sat somewhere between the two, the way most of the truest things he'd ever said to her had, and Joe held it carefully, the way you hold something you aren't ready yet to answer out loud. She left before dawn on Friday, 2 days earlier than she'd said, because she woke in the dark hour, before sunrise, and understood, with sudden and complete clarity, that if she waited until the day she'd promised, she was not entirely certain she'd be able to make herself go at all. She wrote the note by the last light of the banked fire, crouched at the hearth, the folded petition, and the forged survey document both wrapped carefully in oilcloth, and tucked inside her coat, where they'd stay dry, and close and safe. She had one clean scrap of paper left. She used it carefully. Gone ahead to Union City. Taking the evidence straight to the Commissioner, before anyone has the chance to make it disappear. I'll write the moment it's filed. Thank you, for the cabin, the coffee, and for never once treating my mind as smaller than the rest of me. She folded it once, set it against the coffee pot, The place she'd set his letters before, the place that had already, somehow, become their tradition, without either of them ever once discussing it. She picked up her bundle. She looked once at the cabin, the low ceiling, the two chairs, the cold frame just visible, through the window in the gray pre-dawn light, its bean sprouts pushing up green and stubborn against the glass, and made herself not look a second time. She walked out. She did not look back. The stage from Cedar Hollow left at 6 in the morning, and Jo sat in the corner of the coach, with her bundle on her lap, and the evidence wrapped tight against her chest beneath her coat, and she watched the mountains slide past through the window, and told herself, firmly, that this was the sensible thing, the necessary thing, the only thing a person, with any sense at all, would do. She almost believed it. At the first way station, 20 miles east, while the horses were being changed, Jo climbed down to stretch her legs, and it was there, stamping feeling back into her feet on the hard-packed yard, that she noticed the second rider. A man. Alone. A dark coat too fine for the road, a horse too well fed for a working ranch hand's mount, standing off at the edge of the yard, with the particular studied casualness of a man trying very hard to look like he wasn't watching anyone in particular. He was watching her. Jo felt it the way you feel weather changing, a shift in the air, a pressure building somewhere just behind the eyes, and she climbed back into the coach a full 3 minutes before it was due to leave, and she did not look at the man in the dark coat again, and she held the oilcloth package tighter against her chest, and she thought, with a coldness that had nothing at all to do with the morning air, "Somebody already knows what I'm carrying. Somebody already knows exactly where I'm taking it." The coach lurched forward. The way station fell away behind them. And somewhere back at a cabin in the valley, Jo knew Silas Cole would be waking soon to a cold hearth, a folded note against the coffee pot, and a silence that would feel, to him, like something entirely different from the silence he'd spent 8 careful years building his whole life around. She pressed her palm flat against the papers hidden beneath her coat, over the place where her heart was going harder than the road alone could account for, and she watched the mountains give way, slowly, to open country, and she did not let herself cry. Not yet. There would be time enough for that in Union City. Right now there was only the road ahead of her, and the evidence against her chest, and a man in a dark coat somewhere behind her, who already knew far too much about where she was going and why. Union City did not feel like a city. Not really. Felt like a town that had decided to call itself one, and dared anybody to argue. Wood buildings crowded up against brick ones. Mud in the street thick enough to swallow a boot hole. Somewhere in the middle of it, a squat stone building, with a flag hanging limp over the door, a brass plate reading Territorial Land Office, and Jo Whitfield stood in front of that plate with the oilcloth package pressed flat against her ribs, and thought, "This is it. This is the whole thing. Every mile. Every survey record. Every night bent over lamplight until her eyes burned. All of it, funneled down to one door, one clerk, one stack of papers she was about to hand over to a stranger, and trust him to understand what 4 months of her life had gone into proving." She walked in. The clerk behind the desk was young. Bored. Barely looked up. "Filing," he said. Not a question. Just a category he was sorting her into. "A formal complaint," Jo said. "Fraud. Against a survey filing on record for the Morrison claim, Section 14, North Valley." That got him to look up. "Fraud's a serious word, ma'am." "It's the correct word." She set the oilcloth package on the counter, unwrapped it slow, deliberate, the way you'd unwrap something you needed a stranger to take seriously on sight. "Compare the ink. Compare the paper. Compare the handwriting against the 3 genuine survey documents I've enclosed alongside it. The filing's dated 1874, same as the true survey. It isn't 1874. It's 2 years old at most." The clerk looked at the papers. Looked at her. Looked at the papers again. Something in his face changed. "I'll need to get Commissioner Vance," he said, disappearing through a door at the back, and Jo stood at that counter with her heart going hard and fast against her ribs, and thought, "Don't shake. Don't you dare shake now. Not after, no. Not 600 miles. That's somebody else's ride, that hasn't even happened yet. Why is your head already? Stop. 40 miles by coach. That's all this was. 40 miles, and it still felt like she'd walked every foot of it barefoot." Commissioner Vance was 60, humorless, precise in the particular way of a man who'd spent 30 years reading other men's lives for a living, and gotten very good at it. He looked at the forged document 11 full minutes, without a single word, turning it under the lamp, holding it to the window light, running one thumb along the paper's edge like he could read its age by touch alone. "Where did you find this?" he said finally. "Filed in your own index, sir. Against the Morrison claim. And you determined it was false. How?" Joe laid the genuine survey beside it. "The ink," she said. "The original filings, from 1874, carry a brown cast to the black, from age and the iron content of the period's ink. This one's pure black. New. And the paper hasn't taken the soft creasing that comes from being folded and unfolded 10 years running. It's stiff still, barely handled at all." She tapped the margin. "And the notation style. Compare it to the true original. Whoever forged this copied the format well enough to fool a casual read. They did not copy the hand." Vance studied both documents another long moment. "Miss Whitfield," he said slowly, "in 30 years at this desk, I have had exactly 2 clerks bring me forgeries, with this level of documentation. Neither one of them was a woman standing alone at my counter, with a bundle of survey maps, and no lawyer present. I have a lawyer, sir. Mr. Warwick Sloane, out of this city. He's aware I'm filing today." "Good," Vance said. "Because if what you've shown me holds up under review, and I confess I don't see how it wouldn't, this isn't a boundary dispute anymore, Miss Whitfield. This is a federal matter." Joe felt something in her chest loosen, just slightly, for the first time in weeks. "Then you'll open an inquiry." "I'll open an inquiry," Vance said. "And I'll want you present when it's heard." The hearing was set for 3 weeks out. 3 weeks. Sounded like nothing said out loud. Felt like an entire winter once you were actually living inside it. Joe took a room above the Mercantile, cheap, small, one window looking out, over the mud street, and wrote to Silas, that same night. A short letter. Careful. Factual. The kind you write, when you don't entirely trust yourself, with a longer one. Filed the complaint. Commissioner Vance is opening a formal inquiry. Hearing set for 3 weeks. I'll write when I know more. She read it over twice before sealing it. She did not write anything about the man in the dark coat at the way station. Did not write anything about how she checked, over her shoulder 6 times crossing the street to post the letter, or how she'd started sleeping, with the forged document's copy. Vance had let her keep a duplicate, tucked under her pillow like it might grow legs, and walk off in the night. She did not write, either, the thing she meant to write, and then crossed out 3 times, before finally leaving off the page entirely. I missed the coffee. Which was true. And also not the whole truth. And she knew it, sitting there with the pen still wet in her hand. She folded the letter anyway, before she could talk herself into honesty. Because that was the thing about waiting 3 weeks in a strange town, with nothing to do but wait. It gave a person entirely too much time to think. And Joe thought. About the cabin. About the 2 chairs at the table, and which one had quietly, without either of them discussing it, become hers. About the sound of an axe splitting wood in the pre-dawn dark, steady as a heartbeat, and how she hadn't slept properly a single night since she'd left it. About the way Silas had said stay, as long as it takes back in the fall, and how she'd turned those words over in her mind approximately 400 times since, looking for a hidden meaning that maybe wasn't hidden at all. Maybe it had just been sitting there in plain language the whole time, the way the true boundary marker had been sitting in the margin of that old survey, waiting for somebody patient enough to actually look. She thought about Agnes Merrick's face going still. She thought about a man in a dark coat, watching her from the edge of a way station yard, and she thought, not for the first time, that whoever Kane really was, he now knew exactly what evidence she carried, and exactly where she'd carried it. Which meant the hearing wasn't the end of the danger. It was, quite possibly, only the beginning of it. Sloane came to see her twice a week, walking her through procedure, drilling her on what Vance would likely ask, what Kane's counsel would likely argue. "He'll try to discredit you first," Sloane said on the second visit, sitting across from her, with a stack of his own notes balanced on one knee. "Before he ever addresses the forgery itself. Oldest trick in a courtroom. Can't attack the evidence, attack the person who found it. Discredit me how? However he can." Sloane's jaw tightened. "Your age. Your lack of formal legal training. The fact you were living, unmarried, in Mr. Cole's household through the winter. Anything that lets him plant a seed of doubt in Vance's mind, before the document itself is even examined." Jo felt something cold settle in her stomach. "They'll make it about my character instead of the forgery." "They'll try." Sloane met her eyes. "Which is why I need you steady, when it happens. Not defensive. Not apologetic. Just steady. Let the evidence speak, answer everything else in as few words as you can manage." "I can do steady." "I know you can." A small tired smile. "I've watched you do it 3 times now." He came back a third time, unannounced, 2 days before the hearing, and this time his notes stayed in his coat pocket. "There's something I ought to tell you," he said, standing awkward in the doorway of her small room. "A man's been asking after your movements. Around the way stations east of Cedar Hollow. Description matches a fellow Kane keeps on retainer for delicate errands, is the phrase I've heard used." Joe's stomach went cold. "Delicate errands? He never got close enough to you to matter," Sloane said quickly. "You filed too fast. Had the evidence in Vance's hands before Kane's man ever worked out which coach you'd taken. By the time he found you, there was nothing left to take." A pause. "I only tell you now, because you deserve to know you weren't imagining it, at the way station. You were right to feel watched." Jo let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for 3 weeks. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me plainly. I generally try to," Sloane said, and for the first time since the porch, something like real warmth showed in it. The hearing fell on a gray Thursday morning in the second week of June, and the land office's back room, usually reserved for disputes over fence lines and water rights, had been rearranged for the occasion. Long table set in a rough square, Vance at the head, with 2 assistant commissioners flanking him, and Jo sat beside Sloane, with her hands folded tight in her lap, and her spine set, as straight as she could manage. Ezra Doyle was there. Morrison. Purcell. All 4 ranchers, present in force, hats in their laps, faces set. And across the square of tables, Ambrose Kane. Jo had built a picture of him in her mind, over the past weeks, mostly from the shape of his letters, cold, careful, wrapped in reasonable language around unreasonable demands, and the man himself matched the picture almost exactly. Silver at the temples. A dark suit cut too well for a mountain town. A face arranged into an expression of patient, faintly amused tolerance, like a man sitting through a formality he already knew the outcome of. Beside him sat a lawyer Jo didn't recognize. Younger. Sharper around the eyes. Vance opened the proceedings without ceremony. "We are here," he said, "to examine a complaint of fraudulent filing brought by Miss Josephine Whitfield against Kane and Associates, regarding a survey record filed under this office's index against the Morrison claim, Section 14, North Valley." Kane's lawyer rose immediately. "Commissioner, before we proceed to the document itself, the defense would like to address the qualifications of the complainant." Sloane's hand found Joe's forearm under the table. A small, steadying pressure. "Here it comes, Miss Whitfield," the lawyer said, turning to face her directly. "Is not, I believe, a trained surveyor. Nor a licensed attorney. Nor, in point of fact, does she hold any formal credential whatsoever that would qualify her to render expert judgment on a matter of territorial land law. That's correct, Joe said before Sloane could answer for her. The lawyer blinked, momentarily thrown by the directness of it. You admit you have no formal training? I admit I hold no diploma. Joe kept her voice level. Steady. Exactly the way Sloane had asked. My father was a land clerk for 12 years in Ohio. He taught me to read a survey record before I could reliably reach the top shelf of his office. I have spent every day since studying it further. If the Commission would prefer to weigh my findings against a formal credential rather than against whether they are, in fact, correct. She let the sentence hang a moment. I'd invite the Commission to simply examine the documents themselves and judge accordingly. A small silence. Vance's mouth twitched, very slightly, at one corner. A fair point, Miss Whitfield, he said. Continue, counsel, but the Commission would remind you that the validity of a claim does not rest on the credentials of the person who discovered it. Kane's lawyer sat back down, visibly recalibrating. He tried again, from a different angle 5 minutes later. Miss Whitfield resided, unmarried, in the household of Mr. Silas Cole for a period spanning several months this past winter and spring. The defense would suggest this arrangement raises reasonable questions about the objectivity of her findings, given her evident. A pause, deliberately delicate. Personal investment in Mr. Cole's affairs. Joe felt her face go hot. Because that landed exactly where it was meant to land. Because it wasn't wrong, not entirely, and the room seemed to hold its breath waiting to see how she'd answer it, and for one terrible second she felt every eye in that square of tables on her at once, and she thought, Don't let him see it rattle you. That's the whole point of the question. It isn't meant to prove anything. It's meant to make you flinch. So she didn't flinch. I was caught in a blizzard, sir, and Mr. Cole gave me shelter, which any decent person would have done for a stranger freezing on his doorstep. She kept her voice perfectly even. My personal circumstances have no bearing whatsoever on whether the ink in this document is 2 years old or 10. I'd invite you to examine the ink. A short, surprised laugh came from somewhere near the back of the room, quickly stifled, but Joe caught the sound of it, and something in her chest steadied, just slightly, at the knowledge that at least one person in that room had found the lawyer's question exactly as thin as she had. Vance was not laughing. But he wasn't frowning either. Counsel, he said, the Commission has heard quite enough on the matter of Miss Whitfield's character. Unless the defense has objection to the document itself, we will proceed to examining it. Kane's lawyer sat down again, and this time he did not stand back up for a long while. The examination of the document took most of the morning. Joe walked the Commission through everything she'd found, the ink, the paper, the notation style, laid side by side against 3 genuine originals for comparison, and Vance's 2 assistant commissioners bent over the pages, with magnifying lenses, murmuring to each other, and Joe watched Kane's face throughout, watched the patient, amused tolerance drain slowly out of it, and get replaced by something else. Something tighter. By noon, Vance called a recess. By the time the hearing resumed, Ambrose Kane had apparently decided patience was no longer serving him. Because when the room reconvened, it was Kane himself who rose to speak, not his lawyer, and something in the shift of it made the whole room go quiet in a different way, a sharper way, everyone sensing at once that the man had abandoned whatever careful strategy his counsel had planned for him. Commissioner, Kane said, and his voice, Joe noticed, had none of the cold, reasonable politeness his letters had always carried. It was harder now. Direct. I have sat through an entire morning watching this commission entertain the theatrics of a housemaid, with a grudge, and a farmer's imagination for conspiracy. Mr. Kane. Vance started. I am not finished. Kane's eyes swept the room, landed hard on Joe. Miss Whitfield has accused my firm, and by extension, the mining interests my firm represents, of criminal forgery. That is not a small accusation, Commissioner. That is defamation, unless she can prove it beyond any reasonable doubt, and if she cannot, I will personally see to it that she and every rancher standing behind her in this room is sued into the ground for slander." The room went very still. Ezra Doyle's hand tightened on his hat. Morrison's jaw set hard. Joe felt her heart slam once, hard, against her ribs, and underneath the fear, because there was fear, real fear, this man had money, and lawyers and clearly no shortage of nerve, underneath it, something else rose up too. Something steadier. Because he wouldn't be threatening this hard, this directly, if the evidence didn't already have him cornered. She stood. "Mr. Kane," she said, and her voice, to her own quiet astonishment, came out level. "You may sue whomever you like. But you'll be suing over a document that this Commission's own assistant commissioners have already confirmed, under magnification, was filed using ink manufactured after 1882. Not 1874, as the filing date claims." She held his gaze. "I'd advise your counsel to check the record before you make that particular threat a matter of public statement." Kane's face went very still. His lawyer beside him had gone visibly pale. "Commissioner," the lawyer said quickly, standing, "my client withdraws that statement." "It's already been made," Vance said, not unkindly, but with the flat finality of a man who had heard exactly what he needed to hear. And noted. He looked at Kane for a long moment. "Mr. Kane, threatening a slander suit against a complainant in the middle of a fraud hearing, on the record, is either a very confident man's mistake, or a very desperate one's. I confess I am now considerably more interested in which." Kane sat down. He did not say another word for the rest of the hearing. Vance's ruling came 4 days later, delivered to each of the 4 ranchers by written notice, and to Joe by a separate letter addressed simply to Miss J. Whitfield, Union City. She opened it standing in the small room above the mercantile, hands not quite steady, and read it twice, before she let herself believe it. "The Commission finds the survey filing dated 1874 against the Morrison claim to be fraudulent, manufactured within the past 2 years, and filed with intent to defraud. The original boundary lines, as established in the genuine 1874 survey, are hereby confirmed for all 4 claims in question. The matter of the fraudulent filing is referred to federal authorities for further investigation. The Commission commends Miss Whitfield's thoroughness, and extends its formal gratitude for her diligence in this matter." Joe sat down hard on the edge of the narrow bed. "For ranchers' land? Protected. Confirmed. Safe from a company that had spent years circling it like a hawk over wounded ground. Kane, referred for federal investigation. A man who'd threatened her in open hearing, undone, in the end, by nothing more dramatic than ink and patience, and a girl who'd learned to read survey documents at her father's knee." She cried then. Sitting alone on the edge of a narrow bed above a mercantile in a town she'd have left forever, within the week, she cried, not the frightened, ragged crying of that frozen log on the road out of the Ashworth estate, but something quieter. Something that felt, oddly, like relief finally being allowed to breathe. She wrote to Silas that same afternoon. A longer letter this time. The full account, the hearing, Kane's outburst, the ruling, the federal referral. 4 pages, in her careful even hand, and she almost sealed it there. Except she didn't quite. Because at the bottom of the 4th page, after everything practical had already been said, she found herself writing one more line, small, almost embarrassed of itself on the page. "I don't know yet where I'm going next. I only know it isn't back the way I came. Not yet." She sealed the letter, before she could talk herself out of that line too. She did not go back to Cedar Hollow. Told herself it was practical. Told herself the story the town had already half written about her, and Silas would only grow louder now, with her name printed in the territorial land record, with Kane's defeat public knowledge, with every eye in that valley now doubly curious about the woman at the center of it. Told herself, mostly, that she was protecting him. Which was true. And also, underneath the truth of it, a smaller, harder truth: she wasn't ready, yet to say out loud even to herself that she was afraid. Afraid that if she rode back to that cabin now, with the fight won, and nothing left standing between them but the quiet, ordinary business of two people deciding what they meant to each other, she was afraid of exactly how much that decision would cost her if it went wrong. Easier, some cowardly corner of her insisted, to leave the question unanswered. Go somewhere new. Be, for once in her life, simply herself, unattached to any household, any man, any story other people had already decided to tell about her. There was a posting in the Territorial Gazette. A school district out in Fern Valley, Oregon, in need of a teacher for the fall term. Joe read the notice 3 times, then a 4th, and wrote the letter of application, before she'd fully decided to send it, and sent it, before she'd fully decided not to. They wrote back within 2 weeks. The position was hers should she want it. She wanted it. She told herself she wanted it. She packed her bundle, heavier now than it had been in November, weighted down with things that hadn't been hers back then. A wool scarf, handed to her one gray February morning without ceremony. A tin cup she'd somehow, without quite meaning to, brought along from the cabin. Before she boarded, she sent one more letter, not to Silas. To Mrs. Ashworth's estate, addressed to the housekeeper's attention, plain and brief. She'd learned through Sloane, in passing, that the Ashworth household had let Bettina Marsh go some weeks back, over a separate matter of missing linens, and Joe, unable to help the girl directly, unwilling to let the silence between them stand as the last word, wrote simply that if a position ever opened for a capable young woman, with a hard-working family to support, she would personally vouch for the character of one Bettina Marsh, whatever the estate's private ledgers claimed about a brooch that had never once left that girl's own petticoat. She did not sign it, with any explanation beyond her name. She did not need to. Some debts, once paid quietly, stayed quiet. That was enough. She boarded the westbound stage on a Tuesday. She cried the entire way to the Oregon border. Quietly. Steadily. The way the mountain creeks ran in spring, constant, unstoppable, fed by something that had been frozen a long time, and was only now finding its way out. Fern Valley was smaller than Cedar Hollow. Greener. Softer around its edges, the way land gets, when it has never once had to fight a blizzard the way Montana land did. Mrs. Abernathy ran the boarding house at the near end of the main street, and she took one look at Joe standing on her doorstep, with her bundle, and her letter of appointment, and said, "You'll want the room at the back. Quieter. Fewer wagons past the window at dawn." And that was, more or less, the whole of Joe's welcome to Fern Valley. The schoolhouse was small. 14 children, ranging from 6 years old to 14, crammed into a single room built from raw pine and considerable hope. Joe took to it faster than she expected, found, within the first week, that she had a particular patience for the ones who struggled hardest, and it was there, in the back row, that she met 3 children who would come to matter more than any of the rest. Nell was 9. Quiet, watchful, quick with her letters once somebody bothered to slow down for her. Wesley was 8, her brother, and had opinions about everything, and very little patience for holding still. Sam was 11, the oldest, and had the particular careful stillness of a boy, who had learned too young that the world could take things from you without asking permission first. Their parents had died, within a year of each other, the father in a ranching accident, the mother the following winter, of nothing more dramatic than exhaustion, and cold and too little to eat, and the 3 of them were staying now, with a neighboring family, who was kind enough, but stretched thin across too many mouths already. Joe began keeping them late 3 evenings a week. Extra lessons, she told herself. Extra attention, because Sam in particular needed somebody to simply notice him. It was, she realized one evening watching the 3 of them bend together, over a shared reading primer, the first time in a very long while that she had let herself build something, without immediately bracing for the moment it would be taken away. She wrote to Silas once a month, at first. Careful letters. Practical. News of the school, the children, the particular quality of Oregon rain, which fell softer and longer than anything Montana ever produced. He wrote back. Shorter letters, always, but never empty ones, news of the cold frame, which he'd apparently kept tending in her absence, the bean crop coming in strong, the 4 ranchers' land standing secure now under Vance's ruling, Kane's federal case moving slow, but moving, the way such things always did. He never once asked her to come back. She noticed that. Turned it over in her mind more than she'd admit to anyone, including, especially, herself. And in one letter, in October, tucked at the very bottom, after all the practical news had been exhausted, he wrote a single line, that she read, so many times over the following weeks, that the paper began to soften along the fold. The cabin's quiet in a way I've never gotten used to, not once, not even after 8 years of it being the only kind of quiet I knew. She did not know, reading it, exactly what to do with a sentence like that. She folded it, and put it, with the others, in a small tin box of her own now, and did not answer that particular line directly in her next letter, because she did not yet trust herself to answer it honestly. The letter that changed everything arrived on a gray Wednesday in late October, and it did not come from Silas at all. It came, instead, in the form of Silas himself, standing on Mrs. Abernathy's front step in a coat gray, with trailed dust, looking like a man who had covered considerable ground, and had absolutely no intention of turning back around. Mrs. Abernathy answered the door first. Joe, still at the schoolhouse, when he arrived, heard about it second-hand later, and would spend years afterward teasing the full account out of Mrs. Abernathy, one careful detail at a time. "Mr. Cole," Mrs. Abernathy said, taking in the trailed dust, the set jaw, the particular exhausted determination of him. "I know your handwriting. Miss Whitfield's had 4 letters from you this year, and I run this house, which means I read the return address on every single piece of mail that comes through my door. Ma'am, she's at the schoolhouse. Back by 5. Mrs. Abernathy stepped aside from the door. "Come in. You look like a man who's ridden considerably farther than good sense would recommend." He had. 600 miles, near enough, and every one of them sitting now in the ache of his shoulders, and the stiffness in his knees, and he sat where Mrs. Abernathy pointed him, in the front parlor, and accepted the coffee she brought him, strong, real, the kind Joe had apparently insisted on, as household standard wherever she went, and Mrs. Abernathy sat across from him with her hands folded, and studied him the particular way a woman studies someone she has heard a great deal about, and is now forming her final opinion of. "She's built something here," Mrs. Abernathy said. "In case you're wondering whether you're interrupting a life, or completing one. The school boards offered her a permanent position starting next term. The children adore her. 3 of them in particular." A pause, deliberate. "I'm telling you this, so you understand plainly what it is you're asking her to leave, if that's your intention." "I understand it," Silas said. "I rode 600 miles understanding exactly what it would cost." Mrs. Abernathy looked at him a long moment. "She takes her coffee, without sugar," she said finally. "I expect you already know that." "I do." "Good." She picked up her knitting. "Then we'll wait." Joe heard the schoolhouse door, before she saw who was behind it, heard first Sam's voice out in the yard, asking her something about a reading assignment, and her own voice answering back, with that particular warmth she reserved only for children, and then she stepped through Mrs. Abernathy's front door, pulling off her coat, and stopped. Completely. Because there he was. Silas Cole. Sitting in Mrs. Abernathy's parlor like he belonged there, like he hadn't just ridden across half a territory to be there, and for one long, suspended second, either one of them moved at all. "Silas." "Joe." She looked past him at Mrs. Abernathy, who was knitting, with the focused, deliberate attention of a woman working extremely hard to appear uninvolved. "I'll put the kettle on," Mrs. Abernathy said, without looking up, and left the room, with a speed that suggested she'd been waiting all afternoon for exactly the excuse. Joe came into the parlor slowly. draped her coat over the back of the chair by the door, the same gesture, the same particular fold. She'd done it 100 times back at the cabin, and something in Silas's throat tightened watching her do it here, in a different room, in a different territory, and still exactly the same. "You didn't answer my last letter," he said. "You didn't give me time. It's been 3 weeks. I know. You look it. I have something to say," Silas said, and his voice had gone rough at the edges in a way she'd heard from him only twice before, once, telling her about Adeline, and once, the night she told him she was leaving Union City for good. "I've had 600 miles to work it out, and I'd like to say it, before I lose my nerve, which isn't a thing I usually struggle with." Joe's hands folded together in her lap, pressed tight. "All right," she said. He looked at her. And found, sitting there in Mrs. Abernathy's small parlor, with the kettle beginning to hiss somewhere behind the wall, that every carefully organized sentence he'd built across 600 miles of trail had gone straight out of his head the moment he actually looked at her. Because that was the thing about Joe Whitfield. She read straight through anything organized. Straight through anything rehearsed. So he stopped trying to organize it. "I thought I wanted peace," he said instead. "Told myself that for 8 years. That I'd made my choice, and I was living it, and it was enough." He held her gaze steady. "And then you walked through my gate in a blizzard, and inside about a week and a half I couldn't remember what I'd been so peaceful about in the first place." Something moved across her face. Small. Careful. She kept it still. "You left because you loved me enough not to cost me anything," he said. "I know that's why. I've had months to understand it, and I understand it now, and I am not angry about it, not one part of me." He leaned forward. "But peace isn't an empty cabin, Joe. I found that out the first night you were gone, and I have not slept a full night through since. Not once. Not in 11 months. Her breath caught. Just slightly. Just enough that he saw it. "I lie there in the dark," he said, "and I listen for something, and it isn't there, and I spent a long time thinking it was some particular sound I was missing. It wasn't a sound." His voice dropped, rough and plain, and entirely without artifice. "It was you. It's always been you." Joe sat very still. "I came here," Silas said, "not to ask you to give up what you've built. Not to be one more obligation you have to arrange your whole life around." A breath. "I came to ask if you'd let me be the person you come home to. And if you'd let me come home to you." The kettle, somewhere behind the wall, reached its full boil, and began its high, insistent whistle, and neither one of them moved. Joe opened her mouth. Closed it again. Looked down at her folded hands, and then back up at him, and her eyes were not merely bright now. They were full. "Every night since I left that cabin," she said, low, careful, working hard to keep her voice steady, "I've thought about one particular morning. February, I think. Before you were up. I came out, and the fire was already built, and the coffee already on, and you were outside splitting wood in the dark, and when you came back in, and saw me standing at the window, you just nodded. Like I was supposed to be there. Like it was the most natural thing you'd ever seen." Her voice caught. "That was the moment I understood I was already in trouble." He stood. Crossed the small parlor in 3 strides, and stood in front of her chair, and she looked up at him, and he took both her hands in his, and her hands were cold, and he held them anyway, the way you hold something you have already decided you will not let go of again. "I would like you to come home," he said. "Not just to the cabin. Not just to the ranch." He held her hands tighter. "I would like you to come home as my wife. If you're willing." 2 seconds. 3. 4. "The school board offered me a permanent position," Joe said, unsteady now, the words coming faster than she meant them to. "That's a real thing, Silas. I don't want to simply walk away from it. I'm not asking you to walk away from anything you've built," he said. "I'm asking you to build something bigger." Her breath came out in one long, unsteady exhale. You rode 600 miles. I did. You could have written that in a letter. No, he said quietly. I couldn't. That's exactly why I rode 600 miles instead. Joe looked down at their joined hands. At his, rough, strong, careful, the same hands that had once set a surveying manual down in front of her like an offering, that had reached past her shoulder to flip an old document, without ever once making it feel like anything but practical, that had built a cold frame board by stubborn board beside her own hands doing the very same work. Yes, she said. He went very still. Yes, she said again, clearer now, steadier. I'll come home. Something happened to his face then, that she had never once seen in 11 months of living close beside him. Not relief exactly. Not simple joy either. Something underneath both of those things, the look of a man who had been holding his breath for 8 long years, and had only just, finally, remembered how to let it go. He brought her hands up, and pressed them together between both of his, and held them there, and said nothing else at all, and neither did she, and from the kitchen Mrs. Abernathy called out, in a voice pitched very deliberately cheerful, and not remotely surprised. "Tea's ready!" And Joe laughed. A real laugh. Short and sudden, and entirely unguarded, the kind that escapes, before you've decided whether to allow it. Silas looked at her laughing, and understood, without needing a single further word, that he had just heard the exact sound he'd been listening for in the dark, every night, for 11 months. He stayed 2 weeks. Long enough to meet Nell, Wesley, and Sam, and to sit in the back row of the small Pines schoolhouse on a Wednesday afternoon, and watch Joe teach, the particular way she moved through that room, patient with each child differently, understanding without ever needing to be told, that every person's pace belonged to themselves alone. Long enough for Sam, 11 years old, careful and quiet in the way of a boy who'd learned too young what the world could take from you, to walk up to him, after lessons one afternoon, and ask, with complete and terrible seriousness, "Are you going to look after her?" It was a child asking a grown man to account for himself, and Silas treated it with exactly the seriousness it deserved. "Yes," he said. Sam studied him a long moment, then stuck out his hand, and Silas shook it, and something passed between the two of them that needed no further words at all. The wedding was small. Mrs. Abernathy insisted on standing witness, and Reverend Thomas Hale, who ran the Valley's only church, and had, in Joe's few months there, come to think of her as something close to essential to the whole community, performed the ceremony on a bright Saturday morning in early November. Nell wore a ribbon in her hair that Mrs. Abernathy had tied, that morning with her own hands. Wesley managed to sit still for nearly the entire service, which Mrs. Abernathy called, afterward, a genuine miracle. And when Reverend Hale asked Silas whether he took this woman, he said, "I do," the same way he said everything, flat, direct, without ceremony, except his hand holding hers was not flat, or direct at all. It was the grip of a man who had already understood, fully and completely, that this was the one thing in his life he could not afford to lose twice. They rode north in late November, toward Montana, toward the cabin, and the cold frame, and the north fence, with its confirmed boundary, and Joe turned once in the saddle to look back at Fern Valley, the boarding house, the schoolhouse, 3 children standing at the edge of the road, who had promised, all 3, to write every week, without fail, and then she turned forward again, and rode on beside her husband, and after while he reached across, and set his hand briefly over hers on the reins. Just for a moment. Just enough. They rode into the valley on a gray Thursday afternoon, and the cabin sat exactly where they'd left it. Same walls, same roof, the cold frame beside the south wall showing the dry stalks of a bean crop somebody had faithfully replanted in July, exactly as her letter had instructed. Joe climbed down, and crouched beside the frame, and put one hand flat against the dried stalks. "You replanted," she said. "You actually followed the instructions." "I'm a man who follows specific instructions," Silas said, "when they're given by somebody who knows what she's talking about." She looked up at him a long moment. Then she went inside, and found, on the table, a small jar of dried wildflowers, careful and correctly preserved, and understood, without him having to say it, that at some point during the long months she'd been gone, Silas Cole had gone up into the high meadow, and cut flowers, and dried them, and set them out, waiting for a homecoming he could not have been entirely certain would ever come. Ezra Doyle came by the next morning, and this time he knocked, where before he'd always simply ridden up, and called out, from the yard, and when Joe answered the door he took his hat off, and said plainly, "Mrs. Cole." Joe looked at Silas. Silas looked at Ezra. "My wife," Silas said, and something in his voice carrying the word landed, with more weight than the 2 syllables alone should have managed. "I came to say the 4 of us, Morrison, Purcell, me, and old man Weathers, who's got the section east of the school road, we talked it over while you were gone." Ezra's jaw was set, with the particular stubbornness of a man who had already made his decision, and intended to see it through regardless of argument. "We want to put in a proper road. From the valley junction up to your north fence. 12 years it's been a mud track. Ezra, It's not charity," Ezra said flatly. "It's 4 men, who owe a 5th man's wife a road, on account of she saved every one of our land claims, and likely kept us out of a federal fraud case besides. If you fight me on it, I'll come back tomorrow, and fight you right back." He left before either of them could argue further. Joe turned to Silas, something warm and steady settling in her chest. "For ranchers are putting in your road," she said. "Our road?" Silas said. She felt that correction land somewhere low and warm in her chest. "Our road," she agreed. That winter, Joe began writing letters again, not only to Fern Valley, to Mrs. Abernathy and Nell, and Wesley and Sam, faithfully, every week as promised, but to the women of Cedar Hollow too, which surprised nearly everyone, including herself. She wrote to Agnes Merrick first. A short letter, entirely without reference to anything that had passed between them, containing instead a detailed, practical account of the cold frame method, how it might extend a family's growing season by 6 weeks, and cut winter food costs substantially for anyone willing to build one. Agnes wrote back, eventually in a voice that was careful, and a little uncertain, and, over time, not unfriendly. She wrote to Clara Bennett, whose sons needed direction more than pity, and who wrote back, with the tired guardedness of a woman used to nobody offering anything, without wanting something in return. Joe answered with 3 concrete apprenticeship possibilities in Union City, that matched what she understood of each boy's particular strengths, information she'd gathered quietly, from Sloane's own professional correspondence. She did not write to Henrietta Pruitt. Some bridges, she decided, could simply be left standing on their own, untouched, either burned nor crossed. By spring, Joe had turned the front room of the old land dispute filing house in Cedar Hollow, abandoned, since the fraud case had closed, its previous purpose finished, into something new. A small office. A single desk, a shelf of survey manuals, a sign painted in her own careful, plain lettering, Whitfield Coal Land Advocacy. Free counsel for any settler, any small rancher, anyone facing down a company letter dressed up in careful, reasonable-sounding language that was, underneath, asking for something no honest man should have to give away. Word traveled slowly at first. Then not slowly at all. By summer, she had helped 6 families read through boundary disputes of their own, catching 2 more attempted frauds, before they ever reached a courtroom, and Silas, who came by most afternoons on his way in, from the fields, standing quietly in the doorway the way he'd once stood in the doorway of his own cabin, watching her work, found himself, more than once, simply grateful he'd learned, 8 years ago, exactly what it looked like when a person walked through his gate and changed the whole shape of everything that came after. The letters from Fern Valley kept coming, faithfully, every week, exactly as promised. Sam's handwriting improved steadily. Wesley's arithmetic, according to his own proud report, was now the fastest in the whole school. Nell sent a drawing, that Christmas, Two figures standing in front of a cabin, small bright windows drawn, with careful radiating lines, the way a child draws a sun, light reaching outward toward whoever might be standing on the road, looking for somewhere to go. Joe pinned it to the wall of the little office in Cedar Hollow, where anyone who walked through the door could see it. That evening, back at the cabin, with the fire burning low and steady and the whole valley gone quiet under a fresh fall of gentle, unhurried snow, Joe leaned back against Silas's shoulder, and he set his coffee cup down, and his arm came around her, with the ease of something that had, somehow, always been exactly this way. "I used to think home was a place you were from," she said quietly. He waited. "It isn't that," she said. "It's a place you choose. And a person you choose to build it with." Silas didn't answer right away. He simply tightened his arm around her, and pressed his mouth briefly to the top of her head, and outside the snow kept falling, patient and unhurried, the way Montana winter always fell, covering the cold frame, settling soft along the fence line the four ranchers had built together, wrapping itself gently around a cabin that had once, for 8 long years, known nothing but silence. It was not that kind of silence anymore. It never would be again.